For years, Resident Evil fans have been begging Capcom to remake one game above all others, Code Veronica. Despite never receiving a numbered title, many consider it the true sequel to Resident Evil 2. It's the game that brought back Chris Redfield, transformed Wesker into the villain we know today, and introduced one of the most twisted stories in the franchise's history. But because it was released over 2 decades ago, many newer fans have still never played it. So before the remake arrives, here's everything you need to know about Resident Evil Code Veronica. Quick warning, this video will contain spoilers of the original Resident Evil Code Veronica, so if you want to stay completely blind for a potential remake, then now's your chance to click away. Otherwise, let's dive right in. Resident Evil Code Veronica was the 4th installment to the Resident Evil series, released back in the year 2000 for the Sega Dreamcast. A year later, it was updated, modified, and re-released as Resident Evil Code Veronica X, and was now available on the GameCube and PlayStation 2, and longtime fans fully embraced it. For them, Code Veronica represents the moment Resident Evil's story truly expanded beyond Raccoon City, reintroducing Claire and Chris Redfield, as well as Albert Wesker after his apparent death, showing that the series planned to expand outside the confinements of just one corporately corrupt city. It also explored Umbrella's inner workings and laid the foundation for many of the conflicts that would define the franchise moving forward. In other words, it's just a great story. Chronologically, the narrative unfolds 3 months after the harrowing events of Resident Evil 2 and the catastrophic destruction of Raccoon City depicted in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. The plot follows siblings Claire and Chris Redfield as they fight to survive a sudden biological outbreak inside a desolate prison island in the Southern Ocean called Rockfort, later traveling to a frozen research facility in Antarctica. But why are Chris and Claire even here in the first place? If you recall, Claire was searching for her brother Chris inside Raccoon City when the outbreak and immediate destruction hit. She finds Leon and Sherry during the events of Resident Evil 2, and the three eventually make it out of the city before being killed by the explosion. This event caused the three to take on an unwavering task of fighting bioterrorism to make sure something like Raccoon City never happened again. But the day after the destruction, Claire parted ways with Leon, who took Sherry along with him while Claire continued to find her brother. 3 months later, she had a lead that took her straight to Umbrella Europe's Paris laboratory. She boldly infiltrated the high-security facility in December of 1998, only to be captured after a chaotic firefight with corporate security. She was bound and transported to the remote Rockfort Island by Umbrella security officer Rodrigo Juan Raval. However, Claire's arrival was perfectly timed with a devastating sabotage operation orchestrated by HCF, a rival paramilitary organization under the command of Albert Wesker. The attackers successfully compromised the facility, releasing the T-Virus and a horde of bioorganic weapons across the entire island, swiftly decimating Umbrella's local defense forces. Surveying the absolute ruin of his command post and feeling a sudden stroke of pity for his captive, a wounded Raval unlocked Claire's cell and released her, believing that she would likely die in the surrounding chaos anyway. Upon reaching the island's surface, Claire crossed paths with Steve Burnside, a volatile 17-year-old prisoner who had been imprisoned alongside his family after his father was caught selling classified Umbrella secrets on the black market. Banding together, the two survivors began a desperate search for an operational airstrip to escape the infected island. However, their efforts were repeatedly thwarted by Alfred Ashford, the 7th Earl and tyrannical commander of Rockfort, who was convinced that Claire was one of the primary spies responsible for the HCF attack. He serves as one of the primary main antagonists of the game. We'll take a break and talk about him for a little bit because he is one of the most unnerving villains in the entire series. Alfred Ashford is the psychotic, mentally unstable governor of Rockfort Island. His resume doesn't stop short of torture, murder, and dressing in his sister's clothes. Yeah, this guy has some issues, but it's not entirely his fault. His existence basically came from a test tube after his father Alexander genetically engineered him alongside his sister Alexia. He did this to try to create an ultra-intelligent child prodigy that could seize power of the Umbrella Corporation. But sadly for Alfred, being only slightly above average intelligence, was overshadowed by his sister Alexia, who was a genius. This caused him to become deeply obsessed with her and idolize her. And once she forced herself into a cryogenic stasis for 15 years as part of her own research, he ultimately snapped, developing an identity that mimicked his sister as he dressed in her clothes while he tortured prisoners on Rockfort Island as part of his cruel dictatorial rulership. But now that you know that, let's get back to Claire. Before locating a functional aircraft, Claire managed to find an active computer terminal and established a secure connection with Leon S. Kennedy. After surviving the Raccoon City disaster, Leon had secured a position within a covert anti-umbrella unit inside the US government. Utilizing his specialized resources, Leon immediately tracked down Chris Redfield and relayed Claire's exact coordinates, setting her brother on a direct rescue course toward the Southern Ocean. Escaping the fiery destruction of Rockfort Island, Claire Redfield and Steve Burnside arrived at Umbrella's Antarctic base, only to find that the nightmare had already repeated itself. The remote facility had completely fallen to a T-virus outbreak, carried over by the infected personnel who had evacuated Rockfort just ahead of them. While exploring these zombie-infested corridors, the duo discovered that a fully functional Australian polar observation base sat just several miles across the icy waste. Realizing it was their only hope for rescue, they formulated a plan to commandeer a specialized heavy transport truck to breach the frozen tundra and reach the base. But before they could escape, they were cornered by a vengeful Alfred Ashford, who had pursued them to the icy continent. A chaotic shootout ensued, ending when Alfred was shot and tumbled over a deep ledge. Bleeding out and desperate, the dying Earl dragged himself to the cryogenics laboratory, using his final moments to awaken his twin sister Alexia, who had successfully spent the last 15 years fusing to the volatile T-Veronica virus through the controlled cryogenic stasis. Unaware of the sleeping giant they had just unsealed, Claire and Steve fought off a sudden horrifying attack from the mutated Nosferatu monstrosity locked beneath the base. But who is this Nosferatu monster, and what is the end goal of Alexia's cryogenic stasis? Well, it actually turns out they're both connected in a horrifying way. As mentioned previously, Alexia was a child prodigy genetically engineered by Alexander Ashford alongside her brother Alfred, but they weren't actually aware of this. They believed they were just normal kids, but Alexia harbored a dark obsession of her own. She wanted to be the supreme goddess of the world and wanted everybody to fall before her. So once Alexia, at the age of 10, became one of Umbrella's top virologists, she started engineering her own strain of the T-virus called the T-Veronica, named after the Ashford family's genius ancestor Veronica Ashford. It was a strain that was designed to infect the host and enhance their physical capabilities, while also retaining their cognitive function, something that the previous zombies, tyrants, and other BOWs were not able to retain. Alexia identified the secret to doing just this when her and Alfred discovered something damning in 1983. They uncovered the origins of their creation in research notes kept by their father Alexander, which prompted them to turn on him and infect him with the strain of the T-Veronica virus, turning him into the Nosferatu creature we see inside of the game. This served as Alexia's first real test subject, and once she began studying his progress, she came to the conclusion that she could ascend into a goddess-like being through T-Veronica infection as long as the pathogen was administered extremely slowly. This prompted her to complete cryogenic stasis for 15 years, and leave Alfred to take care of the family residence until she was eventually released. So now that you're up to speed on Alexia, let's get back to Claire. Emerging victorious after the Nosferatu battle, they finally located the transport truck and tore out into the snowstorm. Their freedom, however, was incredibly short-lived. Massive plant-like tentacles erupted from beneath the ice, violently flipping the speeding truck. Trapped and incapacitated in the wreckage, Claire and Steve were dragged back into the dark depths of the facility as the personal prisoners of a newly awakened Alexia Ashford. And now, this is where Chris comes into play. In Chris's case, his last canonical appearance was in Resident Evil 1, during the Spencer Mansion outbreak. He had spent the months following the incident investigating Umbrella's European operations, and after receiving Claire's distress signal through Leon Kennedy, he immediately set course for Rockfort Island. By the time Chris arrived, Rockfort was already a war zone. The T-virus had completely engulfed the facility. Upon infiltrating the burning base, Chris crossed paths with Rodrigo, the guilt-ridden Umbrella security guard who had released Claire from her cell earlier during the opening hours of the chaos. As Chris pushed deeper into the crumbling, zombie-infested ruins to track her down, he discovered that Claire had already managed to escape the island altogether. Before he could turn back, however, he was suddenly confronted by Albert Wesker. This was the very first time Chris had seen him ever since Resident Evil 1, so let's talk about why he's actually here in the first place. During the events of RE1, Wesker was the captain of the STARS team that led Chris and the others into the Spencer Mansion. He later revealed himself to be a double agent working under Umbrella and intended for a T-002 Tyrant inside the mansion's laboratory to kill off the remaining STARS team. However, the Tyrant instead attacks Wesker, impaling him through the chest. To the others, Wesker was finished, but unbeknownst to them, he had actually taken a progenitor virus sample prior to this attack, and was resurrected from his injuries when the others had already escaped the mansion, where he discovered he had gained newfound abilities. He fled the mansion before it went up in flames and set his sights on something new, the T-Veronica Virus. He began employment within Umbrella's rival organization and took control of the military unit known as the HCF. Together, they were the ones who led the assault on Rockfort in attempts to retrieve the T-Veronica Virus, and now he believes Alexia is the only one who can provide him a sample. When he encountered Chris, he took the opportunity to flaunt his terrifying new superhuman abilities, casually overpowering Chris before revealing that Claire had already been recaptured and sent to an Umbrella research facility deep in Antarctica. Driven by sheer urgency, Chris managed to commandeer one of the facility's remaining Harrier jump jets, piloting the aircraft across the globe toward the frozen expanses of the Ross Ice Shelf. Upon infiltrating the subterranean Antarctic base, his frantic search finally led him into the surreal icebound replica of the Spencer Mansion, where he discovered Claire, cold and unconscious. Wesker himself traveled to the base in pursuit of Alexia, where he intended to confront her for T-Veronica's samples. However, the siblings' reunion was cut short almost as soon as it began. Forced to separate once again, Claire set out into the freezing depths of the facility to search for Steve Burnside. Left alone on the upper levels, Chris watched from the shadows as Albert Wesker directly confronted a heavily mutated Alexia Ashford, demanding that she hand over a sample of the T-Veronica virus. However, when the terrifying reality of Alexia's new godlike power became apparent, Wesker swiftly fled the scene to save himself. Forced to deal with the mutated Countess entirely on his own, Chris engaged her in a fierce shootout and managed to bring her down, only temporarily neutralizing the threat. Meanwhile, Claire finally located Steve Burnside deep within the facility, but she was met with absolute horror. He had been forcefully mutated into a massive axe-wielding monstrosity by Alexia's virus. Despite the creature's aggressive rampage, Steve's lingering humanity surfaced at the last second. His refusal to kill Claire ultimately triggered his demise, as Alexia's organic pods lashed out and fatally wounded him for defying her control. Meanwhile, Chris managed to locate and activate the Antarctic facility's emergency self-destruct system to purge the viral outbreak once and for all. In the frantic countdown, the Redfield siblings briefly reunited and prepared to make their final escape, only to be violently cut off when the fully mutated dragonfly-like Alexia descended upon them to exact her final revenge. The siblings managed to activate an experimental high-energy weapon known as the linear launcher, but the device required time to charge. Chris ordered Claire to run ahead and wait for him at the Harrier jet while he stood his ground to hold off Alexia. She reluctantly agreed, but as she sprinted toward the exit, Alexia violently blocked off her path and lunged forward to attack. Chris fired a well-placed shot to intercept her, causing Alexia's volatile body to react violently, mutating into a grotesque anthropod-like monster. While Claire used the distraction to flee the room, Chris battled the creature alone. During the chaotic skirmish, Alexia shed her sedentary cocoon body entirely, taking flight as a swift dragonfly-like horror. Just as she prepared to overwhelm him, the linear launcher reached the full charge. Chris aimed, fired, and blasted Alexia out of the sky, permanently finishing her off and ending the Ashford line. With the self-destruct sequence rapidly counting down and the base crumbling around him, Chris rushed toward the extraction point only to find that Albert Wesker had taken Claire hostage. Chris desperately negotiated for his sister's release, arguing that he was the target Wesker truly wanted. Wesker amusedly complied, releasing Claire and stating that killing Chris would provide him with far more satisfaction than even his primary mission of acquiring the T-Veronica virus. During the tense standoff, Chris was horrified to learn that Wesker had already extracted a T-Veronica sample from Steve Burnside's body. Ordering his sister to sprint towards the jet, Chris threw himself at Wesker in desperate hand-to-hand combat, only to be brutally beaten by the villain's overwhelming superhuman speed and strength. As Wesker gloated that his newfound godlike powers were well worth the price of his humanity, Chris used the crumbling environment to his advantage, tripping a release mechanism that sent several massive hanging steel girders crashing directly onto Wesker's head. The crushing impact merely dazed him, but with the entire facility fracturing and exploding around them, both men were left with no choice but to break off the fight. But Wesker promised that the next time their paths crossed would be their absolute last. With the Antarctic base detonating and a chain reaction behind him, Chris sprinted for the extraction lift. He emerged onto the hangar platform just as a massive shockwave ripped through the bay, throwing him violently across the room until he landed hard against the nose of the Harrier jet. Bruised but alive, he scrambled into the cockpit alongside his sister. Chris fired up the engine and piloted the jet out into the polar night, clearing the facility just as a final catastrophic explosion vaporized the entire stronghold below. As they flew toward freedom, Claire asked her brother to promise her that he would never leave her behind like that again. Chris replied that while he wanted nothing more, he couldn't stop running, not until they put a permanent definitive end to the Umbrella Corporation for good. And that is everything you need to know about Code Veronica in preparation for the remake. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like a full in-depth look into the history of the Ashford family, which goes even deeper than Code Veronica, I literally just did a video explaining their entire story, so you can click on it here. But take care, and I'll see you in a new one very soon.